Following is a video of an in-class presentation on legal aspects of the U.S. Coast Guard given by Lieutenant Commander Jeremy Greenwood.
All of you interested in law to pursue that option. The cool thing about where you're at in life is you got a couple tracks to get there. If anybody does want to be a military lawyer, you know, you could graduate here and you could commission into an armed force, and then you could try and be a funded attorney and you can get the military to pay for your law school, and that's available in all the branches. Or you can graduate here, go do something else cool, go to law school on your own dime, and then apply to be a direct commission lawyer, which makes up the majority of lawyers in the military actually. So it's never too late. You've got a good future ahead of you. If you are interested, I'd love to chat with you at some point later, and I'll leave my contact info. So for the rest of you that are just here because you think law is cool, hopefully I can give you some piece of that, and we can talk a little bit about what we do in the Coast Guard. So that's a cool picture. How many people are familiar with the Coast Guard in general? Know somebody in the Coast Guard, have studied the Coast Guard, just think the Coast Guard's cool? Everybody's hand should be up. For sure. Okay. Coast Guard's a really weird hybrid of an organization, as many of you know. Okay? We'll get into some of the authorities that make us weird and why we are unique. But basically what happened is it all started in 1790 with the Revenue Cutter Service, and that's my particular specialty. I'm a cutterman. I like going to sea. I'm a deck watch officer. That's a cool thing I get to do. But that's my heritage, right? But then they blended us with all these other services so that by 1930 we became the modern day U.S. Coast Guard. There was no Coast Guard, as it is said, until about 1930. So everything before that was these individual organizations. So you got the Life Saving Service, the Maritime Service, the Revenue Cutter Service, the Lighthouse Service. Anybody know what this one is? Bottom corner? Tricky one. The U.S. Bureau of Navigation, U.S. Bureau of Inspection and Maritime Navigation. It's kind of a bizarre acronym thing. They merged all these in to create the modern day Coast Guard. So if anybody tells you that it says Coast Guard 1790, that's actually kind of not true. There was no Coast Guard until about 1930. So it's a weird nuance. We like to say that we're the oldest continuous maritime seagoing service. And does anybody know why that is? Yep.
The Navy didn't start there until like 1805.
Yeah, so it actually started, but then what happened? What happened after the Revolution? We fought this great war and we were all scared afterwards. We didn't like standing armies and we didn't like standing navies, so what did they do?
They formed the Continental.
They disbanded the Navy, basically, after the war. By 1789, there was no U.S. Navy. They disbanded it. We recreated it again in time for the French quasi-war. So the Revenue Cutter Service was the only one that continued on after that. So we like to call ourselves the oldest continuous seagoing service, to the Navy's chagrin. A little bit about some of the authorities, and I won't try to drill down. My goal here is to go through a little bit about the Coast Guard, a little bit about how we do our mission and how we do law enforcement at sea, and then shift into some cool stuff, talk about the current operations we do, kind of the nice, sexy stuff, show you some pictures, okay? That work for everybody? Cool, okay. So, at all times we're in armed service, so you can turn to Title 10. Title 10, when I say title, does anybody know what that means? What am I referring to?
U.S. Federal Code.
U.S. Federal Code, exactly. So you'll see 10, USC, and then another number, right? So 10 is the title, and then U.S. Code, and then specifically there will be a section after that. So Title 10 deals with the armed services. We're in there. Title 50, War and National Defense. We have a role in that. We're in there. Title 50, which is an appendix. We are a member of the intelligence community. The Coast Guard Intel program is part of the DoD Intel community. We're a unique agency because we're also part of what department? Department of Homeland Security, exactly. So we're a weird mixed breed. Title 14 is what we're going to talk about a little bit today. That's the Coast Guard's title in U.S. Code. So that's where our law enforcement authority comes from. That's where our organic authority to act comes from. We'll talk about what that means. And then, of course, we also have roles in customs, navigable waters, shipping, transportation. In general, our catchphrase is we're military, multi-mission, and maritime. And we're all those things at all times. So that's why I'm particularly proud of the Coast Guard. Not that our DoD brethren aren't awesome as well, but we got a particularly niche role, both as federal regulators, federal law enforcement, and as military service at all times. So I'm pretty proud, and hopefully I can share some of that with you. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the basics. How do we get to board a boat at sea and exercise the power of the United States government against the people on board? So it all goes back to the very fundamentals of authority and jurisdiction, right? So authority is the government's legal power to act. If you have authority, that means you have legal power to act, right? And we get our authority from a broad range. We'll talk about it. It can be all the way up at international law. Can somebody give me an example of an international law or a customary international law that gives authority? Yep.
UNCLOS.
UNCLOS. There you go. Law of the sea. We regard that as customary international law, but it provides certain nations authority to do certain things, right? Regardless of what your national laws might say. Nations then take that and filter it down and create domestic law. And that's where we'll go through some of the statutes that apply, that we apply at sea. Wide variety of areas, okay? And then, of course, policy winnows it down, right? So you might have a law, right? CHP might have a law that says if you break the speed limit, you are in violation of California Penal Code, blah, 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 blah. But do they pull you over if you go 1 mile per hour always?
No.
Because they might have a policy then that says what? We only pull over if it's more than 5 or more than 10 or whatever, right? Just because you have that law in the books doesn't mean you have to do it. It's a policy, it's like a funnel, and I'll show you some examples later on how that works. And then there's the more complicated part, and that's jurisdiction. So it's the government's power to exercise its authority. That's confusing, right? That probably doesn't make much sense. Just because you have authority doesn't mean you have jurisdiction. So in other words, I might have the authority as a federal law enforcement officer to enforce drug laws at sea. But can I enforce drug laws at sea everywhere in the world? Probably not, right? Because I'm lacking jurisdiction in some regard. So we look to 3 different elements. I'm going to go through each one, give you some examples. We have to have jurisdiction over the vessel. We got to have jurisdiction over the location of where we are with the vessel in some cases. And then we have to have a substantive law. And that just means, is it illegal, right? So there might be a U.S. vessel on the high seas, but what's the third part I need before I can take law enforcement action?
Something illegal.
They got to be doing something illegal. It's not illegal to operate a boat on the high seas, right? We're going to wake everybody up. I know it's late. Okay. So that's the most important thing. So we look to those 3 things. Once we have the authority and the jurisdiction, we can take enforcement action. Okay, this is high-level stuff. I appreciate your patience as we go through it, and we'll get to the more exciting stuff. And like I talked about, we start all the way at the top and we look, are there any international law on point? Are there any treaties, customs? This is particularly important in the maritime world because, as you know, oceans touch the majority of the world and they involve multinational pieces of players coming together in different ways. So domestic law is not going to cut it when you look and you're dealing with things on the high seas. So we usually will start international law and we'll look to U.S. law. And then we'll kind of move down. We'll look to a strategy. In other words, does the United States care about what's happening, where it's happening? So do we care about drugs off the coast of Oman? Maybe not, right? And we may not, therefore, allocate resources to focus there. We get out of doctrine, policy, tactics, and techniques, and all the way down into the concept of operations and stuff like that. You don't need to really worry about it. But basically, where I am as a lawyer is all the way at the bottom here. After we've sorted all this stuff out, we've looked and analyzed all this stuff, then we get to the person at the deck plate level who's taking the law enforcement action. And they have to find a way to make it, I have to find a way to make it easy for them to understand why they're there and what they're doing based on all of those different authorities and directives that they need to take into account. It's hard because do you think that the California Highway Patrolman or do you think that your average FBI agent can consume and digest every single piece of international law, U.S. law, and everything that's happening out there? No, they just can't. So what we do as lawyers is we try to make it easy for them. We try to make it cut and dry. We try to train them. We try to give them the tools they need to do very specific mission that they're working on at any given time. Let's go to the next slide here. So a little bit of verbiage here. 14 U.S.C. 1 says the Coast Guard shall be a military service and a branch of the armed forces at all times. So those of you in the room that didn't know we were a branch of the armed forces, we're often the forgotten 5th stepchild. And you get used to it after a while watching the news. But we are at all times in military service. We trace our authority all the way back to 14 U.S.C. 89, which I'm going to go into in more detail, which basically gives us this really broad authority that dates all the way back to the First Continental Congress. And I'll have a slide on that in a little bit. But some examples, for instance, the Port and Waterway Safety Act. We can control vessels in areas subject to the jurisdiction. That's the captain of the port authority. You may have heard about a captain of the port in each port. That captain of the port can give vessels directions to move and go wherever he wants them to go for safety reasons, right? And then the Magnuson Act is sort of an anti-terrorism act that talks about the movement of foreign vessels when they're in our waters and our control over foreign vessels, including our authorities or our obligations under international law to do port state exams and port state inspections. So just a small sampling of that stuff. But this is really our bread and butter. If you remember only one thing about the Coast Guard and law enforcement, we trace it back to this statute right here, 14 U.S.C. 89. Anybody know who that guy is right there?
Alexander Hamilton.
Alexander Hamilton, why is he important?
Because he founded the Revenue Cutter.
Because he founded the Revenue Cutter Service. I like this guy. I'm going to try and break it up. Someone else has got to get it. We'll keep it quiet. That's a cheat. We need somebody else to go.
Thanks.
Okay. Alexander Hamilton is also a great musical on Hamilton. Highly recommended. I was going to open my lecture with that clip, but you should definitely see it when it comes to town. Inquiries, examinations, inspections, searches, seizures, and arrests upon the high seas and waters over which the United States has jurisdiction for the prevention, detection, and suppression of violation of laws of the United States. That's pretty broad. That basically says the Coast Guard can go out and do anything, if you really read it broadly, right? Just take a read to it. It goes all the way back to the First Continental Congress. We guard this jealously, and this is why I was talking about that hierarchy of things. Just because you can do something, the lawyer's job then is to say, should you do something? And analyze that next step, right? We have broad law enforcement authority at sea. It's the reason why a Coast Guard boarding can take place on any vessel. We don't have to suspect you. We don't have to have, a CHP officer to pull you over. Usually has to have some level of suspicion or some reasonable belief that you're violating the law, right? Boating, however, is a regulated activity. We can go on board you anytime to conduct our administrative portion of our boardings. We have broad authority to do that under 14 U.S.C. 89. So we're really, really powerful tool that we try to guard. But before we do any boarding, we always want to look. What's the flag of the vessel that we're about to board? Where are we, the location, and what is that boat doing? Is it doing something illegal? Take all that in to try and analyze whether we have authority and jurisdiction. Some examples. So vessel nationality. Does anybody know what the term exclusive flag state jurisdiction refers to? What do I mean when I say exclusive flag state jurisdiction? Somebody else besides these guys. Just break it down. What does it mean? What's a flag state?
The country or ship is flagged.
Say that again?
Country or ship is flagged.
Yep, the country or ship is flagged in, exactly. So what does that mean then? If I flag my ship in Panama, what does that mean?
You're registered.
Okay, it means I'm where I'm registered. So in international law, who has the primary authority over my ship if I register in Panama? Panama, right? So when we approach a Panamanian ship, what should our mentality be as a U.S. law enforcement team? We don't have authority. We don't have any jurisdiction there because that is whose boat? Panama's, right? So if there's some criminal activity on board under international law, under UNCLOS, and under the customary doctrine we follow of UNCLOS because we're not a party to it, who should be responsible for criminal activity on board that boat? Panama, right? The law of the sea says that each nation, each vessel shall be allowed to register in one country only, and that country has exclusive flag state jurisdiction over them. So that's the basis which we enter into everything. And how many U.S. flag vessels are there in the world? Not enough is the answer, right? So we have to find ways to use respecting that authority to be able to get jurisdiction on different vessels. And I'll talk about how we do that. Sovereign immunity. What's a sovereign immune vessel? Somebody.
It has no flag state or?
No, we're not there yet. But keep that in mind, we're going to get to that. Sovereign immune. What is a sovereign? If I said that Queen Elizabeth is the sovereign of Great Britain. What's that? Has control over Great Britain. And what does that mean? So if I approach a British warship and I'm the U.S. Coast Guard boarding team, can I go on board?
No.
Why not? Because they're sovereign immune. You got it. That's it. Exactly. Right? So vessels that are warships, vessels that are wholly owned by a government for non-commercial purposes, those are generally considered to be sovereign immune. In other words, they are immune because they fall under the sovereign, and nobody can kill the king, right? Nobody can touch the king. The term sovereign just means king, okay? So that is extended to us as well. We wouldn't allow a foreign boarding team to come aboard a Coast Guard cutter or a Navy ship or anything else that's owned by the government. So that's the term of sovereign immunity. A vessel without nationality, what's that?
Pirate ship.
What's that?
A pirate ship.
Okay, it could be, but a pirate ship could, you could be engaged in piracy and claim a flag state. You'd be stupid. But. So what is a vessel without nationality?
Any unflagged ship?
Yeah, it's on flag. It's a guy you meet, it's that guy in the sailboat that sit out to Richardson Bay here and says, I'm a man of the world. I claim no state. I like my methamphetamine here, and you cannot come on board because I'm not registered in the United States. I'm not registered in any country. I visit Berkeley once a year. That's a vessel without nationality, right? But they really do exist. There are vessels plowing the high seas, generally engaged in illegal fishing and other types of activities, who aren't validly registered in any state. The other way you can become a vessel without nationality is, I told you earlier, you only get the protection of one flag state. So what happens if I claim two? What's that?
You get kicked out of both.
Yeah, you get kicked out of both, and we get to treat you as without nationality, right? Or you claim one, you claim Panama, and I go to Panama, and they say what? They say that's not ours. We have no idea who that is. They haven't paid their registration in forever. They're not keeping up with the requirements to be Panamanian registered, and then you become a vessel without nationality. Obviously, we'll go a little bit more over the location. You guys know most of this stuff, but I'm going to give you a good slide on it. And then substantive law. So domestic, foreign, international law, and that prohibits something, right? It's got to be illegal, or there's no point in us being there to conduct law enforcement activity. Okay, so a little bit about flag. So there's an example, right? You could just fly a flag, flapping in the wind. Whose flag is that?
Luxembourg.
Nope.
Oh no, Mecklenburg, right?
No.
Azerbaijan.
No. Oh man, you guys are thinking too much. Think of drugs.
Colombia.
Colombia. That's a Colombian flag, exactly. So some ships, straight up, just flying a flag, right? Well, the good thing this isn't a geography class. What's that? What are we referring to there? How do we know that vessel? You probably can't see that too well, but
Oh, RN.
that says CF 2579AB.
California.
Is that a sign of nationality? Yeah, it's a California registered vessel, which indicates that it's probably registered where?
California.
In California or the United States, right? The United States is a little weird, right? Because we have those state registries for recreational vessels, including vessels of pretty high tonnage in some states. They can also be documented in the United States, but either one, they're U.S. vessels. Let me go back. And how about this guy up here on the right? What do we think he is?
Drug runner?
He's a drug runner, probably, right? Does he have any indicators of nationality that we can tell what he is?
No.
So how do we get on board that guy? So this guy we call who? We call Colombia, we say, hey, can we board your boat because we suspect it's carrying drugs inside this fishing boat. This guy, do we have to call anybody? No, we just go on board, right? But what about this guy? How do we get on, what do we do with that guy? I don't know whether to call on you because you might be cheating.
Okay, it's fine.
I'm just kidding, go for it.
Well, I think it would depend. I mean, what if they're like in Grenada's waters or some other country's
Okay.
waters in the Caribbean, and they have different maritime laws? Could you utilize that?
Great question. So if that boat's in Grenada's waters, who should we call? We can call Grenada because they have coastal state authority, and we'll go over that a little bit later at the beginning. What else can we do if this boat's on the high seas? It doesn't seem to have any registration whatsoever. Do we have any way we can stop that boat and talk to it and find out what it is?
Take the engine out.
That's what we end up doing, but what legal authority do we use to do that? Has anybody heard of a right of visit boarding? Nope? Perfect, then I get to be the first one to teach you about it. So under international law, all warships can approach any vessel that's not a sovereign immune and can ask it questions, and if necessary, board it to determine its nationality. And why do we do that? That stems all the way back to the 18th century.
So that you can know who's in your waters and what they're doing there, and possibly whether or not they're being influenced by forces you don't want.
That's absolutely correct, except the rule applies anywhere in the world in the high seas. So another vessel, if it's a warship, can approach any vessel, such as that one, and ask it questions, which is called a right of approach under international law. And then if necessary, you can go aboard, which is called a right of visit. So we call them ROA and ROV. And that is the right of every warship in the world. And they do this because back in the old days, right, you didn't have you didn't have radar, you didn't have huge telescopes that could see out forever. So when you approached a vessel, you didn't necessarily know what it was, and sometimes you didn't know until you get right up on it, it was the enemy, or that it was the same warship, it was the same ship as yours, it was a US flagged vessel. So right of visit became a concept by which a ship could send out a boarding team, get aboard, and find out if it actually is registered in your country or in another country. But that's it, it's a limited scope boarding. So that's the international law principle we use to shoot out their engines and stop them if they won't stop. Yep.
Just answer the question.
Yep, so you can use force under international law, and I don't want to get into details. There's a big international law case that's famous about the use of force at sea to conduct one of these right of visit boardings. But basically, you can use any reasonable force, minimum force necessary to compel compliance, to effect one of these right of visit boardings. Because we want to know what that is. Why do we want to know what flag that boat is flagged in? Yep.
You know whose rules they follow and who's near what, since all warships are sovereign territory of the nation that sails them, you want to know who's near our name.
Well, with this guy, we think he's doing what? You all said, when you looked at that picture, you thought what? That guy's smuggling drugs. But do I get to stop all drug smugglers anywhere in the high seas, anywhere they are? No. So why am I going to stop that boat? Any idea? What do I need? I need three things, right? I need jurisdiction over the vessel. How am I going to get jurisdiction over that vessel?
There's no identification.
I got to stop it, conduct one of these right of visit boardings, and find out where it's registered. That's the bottom line. And then we go from there. Yep.
Another question, like on that Columbia ship, so if you called Columbia and they're like, no, you can't outboard it, then like you just let it go, even if you're like, there's drugs on there, but
That's it.
Okay.
With one exception. Does anybody know what universal crimes are?
Yeah.
And what are some examples of universal crimes?
Human trafficking.
So slave trade, which some would argue human trafficking is not the same thing. You're just telling you legally, that's a sometimes a disputed topic. What else? Piracy.
Genocide.
What's that?
Genocide.
No, genocide's actually not, because a ship wouldn't be able to carry out what the legal definition of genocide is most of the time. No, but terrorism is actually not a reason, believe it or not.
Murder?
It's a weird one. It's illegal broadcasting. Don't ask me why, but that's actually a universal crime. These are crimes that are recognized by the world to be so heinous that every vessel has jurisdiction over any vessel suspected of doing that.
Just a
Yes,
comment, we do have a separate international law class, which is going on right now, and I recommend you take it, because we talk about all these issues in that class.
Perfect. And so we can't get into all the details of it, but the stuff really is interesting. So I absolutely agree. All right, let's move on. Anybody ever seen this slide before? It's called the Jello block slide. It's Law of the Sea 101. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but obviously inside the territorial seas of any nation, who has the primary authority? What's that? That country. So what happens if I'm a Honduran flagged vessel and I'm in the U.S. territorial seas inside how many nautical miles? 12. Who has primary authority? The U.S., but who also has authority? Honduras, right? So both would have some form of authority, correct? Now, could Honduras steam their warship into U.S. waters and board that boat? No, not absent some agreement. So who would have primary mostly? The United States, right? And then you go out and you get into the contiguous zone. What kind of laws can we enforce in our contiguous zone? Customs. The acronym I'll give you is FISC, F-I-S-C. And it's fiscal, financial, immigration, sanitation, and customs. And we can do that all the way out to 24 nautical miles. And what can we do in that exclusive economic zone? Fisheries and natural resources, which includes mineral rights, the seabed, and that's a bit more controversial, but fisheries, natural resources type things. And then the high seas, which is where we do a lot of our work that we're going to talk about. I like this slide, it just gives you a quick, example of Coast Guard authorities. Where are we at our maximum authority? Where can the Coast Guard do the most bang for the buck for the taxpayer and to suppress crime? And that's on navigable waterways and territorial sea of the U.S., aboard U.S. vessels, aboard stateless vessels, because a stateless vessel gets the protection of how many flag states? None, right? So everybody can exert their authority over it. Facilities adjacent to U.S. waters, and maritime access and movement control. So that includes foreign ships inside U.S. waters. That's where the Coast Guard's at its bullseye. That's where we have the most authority to do what we need to do. Once we start working our way out, foreign flag vessels on the high seas with flag state consent, because whose authority are we operating under when we do a boarding like that? If we go to that Colombian fishing vessel and Colombia says, go ahead and board, whose authority are we boarding under? Colombia's, right? Not our power. Foreign territorial seas, same thing. If Colombia says you can come on into our territorial seas and conduct a patrol and enforce laws, we're operating under their authority. And then some other stuff you don't really care about. And then all the way out, law enforcement ashore. That's not the Coast Guard's gig. That's not what we do. So how do we get on board and make these arrangements? How do we call Colombia? How do we call Honduras and ask them permission to do things? We at the Coast Guard are really proud. We have these really cool counter-drug bilateral agreements that we've negotiated. I think we're up to 41 of them now, but these are the ones that are relevant. We get to travel around. I've gotten the privilege to go down and negotiate these things. It's really cool work. Every year we refresh them. But we basically have agreements with each of these countries that says, hey, if we come upon one of your ships flagged in your country, can we have an expedited way of asking you for permission to board and seeing if it actually is registered in your country? And if it is registered in your country, can we have an expedited way where we can get permission to board, search, and seize what we find down there? And oh, by the way, if we do board, search, and seize, can we have permission to have jurisdiction over the people and fly them back to the United States and prosecute them? And so we have those agreements with a lot of countries. Not every country, but most of the ones that we do the most work with. As you can imagine, where do you think most of our flow comes from? Of drugs.
Mexico and Colombia.
Mexico is a big one. Colombia. Where else? Venezuela. And into Ecuador. So most of these countries, and I'll show you a good slide in a little bit, but these are transit countries. Central America generally is not producing anything. They are transit zones. Where most of the stuff is coming from, the source countries we call them, that's Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador. And so we have agreements with all of those countries, including many in the Caribbean, to do this kind of work. Shipboarding means we will allow you to board ships that are flagged in our country. Ship rider means, you know what, Coast Guard, we will give you a body from our government, from our Navy, from our Coast Guard, to ride on your ship. And by doing that, we will give you the authority to act on our behalf everywhere. Pursuit, that is, if you're chasing somebody, Coast Guard, we will let you chase them into our territorial seas if you need be, if it started out in the high seas. Entry to investigate means, hey, Coast Guard, if you suspect that some bad guy's in our waters, you can go in there to take a look and see if you can find him. Overflight, that's common sense. That just means you can fly over our territorial seas and our territory. And then in order to land is basically, we have a lot of air traffic that comes through carrying narcotics from Central and South America. And Coast Guard helicopters and Navy helicopters can give an order that's lawful for that aircraft to land in our territory, and then we will pursue them from there. And then IMIS is a really cool procedure called International Maritime Interdiction Support. And IMIS basically says, for the bad guys we capture out on the high seas and we detain, certain countries will allow us to bring them into their country, and then the DEA brings an aircraft down and flies them back to the United States for prosecution, and that country agrees not to exert jurisdiction over those people and agrees not to interfere with the process. So it's a pretty neat program. It's how we basically keep these detainees at sea after we interdict them and transport them back for trial in the United States. And I'll show you some of the recent cases we've gotten. Long story short, this is what it all comes down to. What's the flag? What's the location? And what's the activity we're doing? Do we have the authority to take LE action in jurisdiction? So in this case, if we have a Honduran flag vessel, it's on the high seas, and we suspected of drug smuggling, do we have the authority to take LE action? What do we have to do? We got to call Honduras, right? If it's a Honduras flag vessel, and Honduras can do what?
Can say yes.
They can say yes or they can say no, and that determines our ability and what our next course of action is. Hopefully this video plays, but here's a recent case we've had. Show you some cool stuff, hopefully. So this is from one of our maritime patrol aircraft, a C-130, and this is off the coast of El Salvador, and hopefully it loads. Give it a second. Sometimes it takes a minute here at the beginning. No. May not play in this format, I apologize.
Is it on YouTube?
It is not, actually, unfortunately. No worries. Basically, this boat, this is that Honduran flag drug vessel. He's throwing bales overboard, and then he's taking gasoline out and dumping it all over the boat, getting ready to light it on fire. It's a cool video. I will try to get it play. I'll try and send it over so you guys can see it later.
That'd be great.
I'll try one more time. Circle with that. It worked when I did it before. I also have a CD I can try it on too later.
Might need to insert your pen card.
Okay. So here's a little diagram of what I'm talking about. So this is an older one. This is fiscal year 2011. I have some updated stats, but you're looking at about 769 metric tons of cocaine that flow through the transit zone to the United States each year. We are up quite significantly this year, and I'll show you our fiscal year 15 slide. But the majority of that stuff is coming through Mexico, Central America. 9% of that is in the Eastern Pacific, which is the area where District 11, where I work, we control the Eastern Pacific, going all the way down to Peru. District 7 in Miami, Florida, controls the Caribbean side, and they only see about 4 or 5% of it. That Western Caribbean statistic is way down. They don't see 46% go through that end. We see the majority of it in the Eastern Pacific. We see it in a variety of conveyances. I'll show you some pictures here. But just a general idea of the threat we see. So here's fiscal year 15. You'll see this. We had 71,929 kilos. We detained 265 people for prosecution in the United States, and 27 suspected people, so people we couldn't build a case against, that either got returned to their home country or otherwise let go. But does anybody know what an SPSS is, the green dots? So an SPSS, I'll show you a picture, is a semi-submersible sub, basically. It's used to smuggle drugs. These things are pretty neat. I have a picture of one a little bit here. The blue dots are just places where bales were jettisoned and left in the water. I'll show you some pictures. They leave bales with these GPS buoys so that they can, fishermen or other go-fast vessels can come by and pick them up later. Go-fast vessels is the primary target. These are just open hold, center console, 2 to 3 outboard engined vessels that are about 30 feet in length. And they're carrying somewhere about 500 keys of cocaine on average. And they're making the run in these small boats, literally from about here at the Colombia-Ecuador border. They run out, and then they run straight up to the Guatemala-Mexico border. And they do all this in a 30-foot boat. They get refilled along the way by fishing vessels. See the red dots where we busted fishing vessels. And there's a number of them out there that are actually logistics supply vessels. Their only job, they fake fishing all day long. And then at night, they refuel go-fast that are making that run. And I can tell you at any given time, on any night, we interdict at least one. So one a night, which is pretty amazing considering this area is as big as the United States. It looks small here, but if I laid the United States on its end, this would be the tip of Maine, In California, it would be somewhere over here. And we're patrolling it with maybe 3 assets out there at any given time, Coast Guard cutters, usually 1 or 2 Navy ships, and then we'll have Canadian partners sometimes on this side. But just a little idea of the threat and recent statistics. So this is a picture of them. This is some recent ones. Obviously, I can't give you super recent ones because they're still pending prosecution. It takes about 6 months to a year to get these guys fully through the system with the Department of Justice and get them in jail and then be able to release. But that's the type of boat we're talking about. You see about 500 keys. That one only had 118. And you usually see 2 to 3 to 4 people on board these boats. And that's, these are typically guys getting paid maybe about $5,000 to make the run. They're low-level people, but the idea of grabbing these guys is, number one, we get the drugs in their bulk quantity before they distribute. If you talk to Border Patrol or you talk to Customs, they're getting a brick here, a brick there. By the time it gets to the land side of the border and brought up to the United States, it's been distributed and cut up into 100 different couriers. So the bulk load is really where we believe we can hit them the hardest, and the amount of drugs we take in, it rivals any other federal agency combined, because this is how they're getting it from Colombia and Ecuador into the transit zones, Mexico generally, where it gets broken up and brought by land couriers. Yep.
What do you do with the drugs?
Yep, so the drugs, they stay on a Coast Guard cutter for their entire patrol. We try and gather them up into a bulk load, and then we do a bulk offload in San Diego or Miami, depending where the cutter's home port is. And a DEA comes and picks them up, and then they take them to a lab, test them, and destroy them. So you'll see if you Google, there's been a bunch of press releases. The cutter Bertolf, one of our large national security cutters, just did the largest offload in history in San Diego. Secretary of Homeland Security was there, big hoopla.
They just destroy them like
They just burn them.
Yeah.
They go to a special DEA lab. And so there's a ton of them, literally.
It's literally a ton.
Here's our fishing vessels we're talking about. This is some of the logistic supply vessels. They have larger loads, right? So 2,678 keys. The Goliath one of our bigger one. You'll see these boats sometimes right in plain view, sometimes in hidden compartments. And I'll have a slide on that next. Here's a self-propelled semi-submersible submarine. Usually built in Colombia, about 80 feet long. You've got to be a pretty ballsy person to get in one of those. But
You wouldn't have to be able to tell us the stats of what cartels or what organizations.
yeah. So generally, most of that stuff is unfortunately at the LE sensitive level. Once it's back into Mexico, they're the cartels you read about in the paper, Sinaloa. The folks that are taking the last step. The ones deep in Colombia, we generally keep those as LE sensitive. The ones that have the sophistication to build these subs in the jungles of Colombia. So generally what happens is there'll be a small compartment here for living space where you'll have 2 guys, one navigating at all times and the other one sleeping usually. There are no heads, no facilities. They urinate into buckets and then dump it overboard when they can. The contraband is all in sealed compartments, usually in the fore and aft. And these things are extremely dangerous. So they're so dangerous because most of the time they scuttle when upon detection, that the Congress created a law called DTVIA, the Drug Trafficking Vessel Interdiction Act. And it makes it a crime just to operate one of these. We don't need to recover the drugs. We don't need to prove that there was drugs on board. The very fact that you're operating a semi-submersible vessel evading detection is a crime in and of itself, with a felony worthy of about 10 years. Yep.
So it's illegal to own any semi-submersible?
It is illegal to own an unregistered semi-submersible. So if you want to go create one and register it with the United States and can properly label and pass a safety inspection, I wish you the best of luck. Yes?
There may be a situation where one of those is made a vessel or something?
So surprisingly, we've not seen that. You would think, but we have not seen that. They're really hard to find. And I think given the areas where they operate, there's just really low shipping traffic. They're not taking this into the Gulf of Panama through the canal area. I mean, they're running way offshore south of the Galapagos typically, and then cutting straight up into Mexico. Yep.
What exactly is scuttling?
Scuttling is basically sinking your boat yourself. So pulling a valve that then lets the sea in. So they'll have a scuttling valve, so that they can sink these things before we arrive on scene. Mostly so they can jettison all the drugs, get rid of the drugs. Good question.
And they just put on their life vests?
They don life vests and go into the water. They wait for us. So that's why we had to make it a crime, because what was happening is the law we typically use, and I didn't want to get into a ton of detail on it, but it's called the Maritime Drug Law Enforcement Act, and it requires there to be a representative sample of drugs that comes back to the court. And so we were having a very hard time getting drugs. Number one, we don't want to put our people down into these things, because at any moment that thing could capsize. You have no idea how that was built. I mean, this isn't Northrop Grumman making this submarine. I mean, this is 3 dudes in the jungles paid by drug cartels. They're really high quality for what they are, but I still don't know that you want to hop inside of one. So we were having a really hard time recovering a representative sample of the drugs, and so we put in a legislative change request, and Congress actually agreed with us. It was a big problem back in 2011. So they passed the law, we saw a lull, and all of a sudden this year we're seeing a resurgence of them, and we've gotten 5 so far this year. And that's just in 2016. So these are gigantic. I can't exaggerate how much. I mean, we're talking about a load of 8 metric tons of cocaine in a submarine below water.
What's the street value for that?
What the street value of 8 metric tons? I'd have to go to the DEA calculator, but I'll bet you that is in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Easily. So here's some examples of where we go to find these. We do what's called 100% at-sea space accountability. When we get on board a fishing vessel or we get on board one of these pangas, sometimes it'll look like there's nothing on board. And so we'll have to go hunting for it. So we'll do a minimally intrusive search, usually at first. Take a drill a few holes in. And what you see here is white powder on the end. You test that, that's cocaine. Right below there, you tear the deck open and you find this underneath the hull. So you generally will use drawings and we'll try and figure out, hey, where's there a hidden compartment on this boat? And it sounds easy to do, but it's really tough when you're at sea and you're bobbing up and down and there's compartments. You don't know if you drill into it if it's going to let the sea right in. So it's a pretty cool tactic. Yep.
How long do the searches take?
Depends on the size of the boat. So if you get a fishing vessel, a 60 to 80 foot fishing vessel, that could take all night. That would probably take 8 to 10 hours to get 100% at-sea space accountability with that. Because there's tanks you have to sound, and you have to do volumetrics on it to figure out if there's a hidden tank inside the tank. So one trick they'll do is they'll put fuel. They'll take the fuel tank, but there will be a larger tank outside the fuel tank, and the drugs will be around the fuel. So when you take soundings, up comes gasoline or diesel, but in reality, if you did the measurements, if you compared where it's supposed to be to how much volume you're seeing, you'll note that there's a missing space. It's all math. I'm a lawyer, so I don't do math.
How much evidence do you need, or like how much do you need to go off of before you start like drilling holes in some guy's boat?
That's a good question. So the legal standard for this first part, this minimally intrusive search we call it, is reasonable suspicion. So it's the best definition I can give you of reasonable suspicion is it's something above a hunch, right? So you can't just have a hunch. You have to have some articulable fact that says, not only do I think this boat is shady, but I think because there's fresh fiberglass on this area, that there's probably something below that. Sort of a reasonable person standard. A reasonable person would think that there could be evidence of a crime underneath that. Does that make sense? To go that next step to a destructive search where we're tearing open bulkheads, we're permanently destroying the vessel, we use probable cause. Probable cause, again, to legal standard, that's basically that higher level up, that next level up of, when presented all the facts, a reasonable person would believe it's more likely than not that a crime, there's evidence of a crime in that space. More likely than not, kind of, sort of, is the standard. Probable cause is really a tricky thing to get your head around sometimes, but if you had to think of it as a level, there's no suspicion, reasonable suspicion, probable cause, and then above that is like a preponderance of the evidence, and then beyond a reasonable doubt, the courtroom standard.
The little stair-step chart we looked at last week.
Oh, perfect. See, you already told me. Yep.
So what happens if you perform a minimally intrusive or even destructive and don't find anything?
The U.S. government buys a boat. We hand you a claims form and we say, have a nice day, in English and Spanish. Literally, that's it. It's a cheap cost. You know what? The operation costs millions of dollars to put a U.S. warship, or a Coast Guard cutter, or a Navy ship on target and doing this mission with aircraft overhead, sometimes submarines involved. Takes millions and millions of dollars of taxpayer money. So I'm not going to think twice about a $3,000 bill for somebody's equity. That's rubies, you know. It's nothing. It's like, yep.
What are the long-term overall benefits of this mission of just stopping the drugs from coming in? Like if they just did, and we had an overabundance of drugs and the costs went down, and like I don't know what the theory behind like spending a lot of money to just stop them from coming in versus other things we could do on land, or I don't know.
And I don't want to get into a huge policy discussion, but I struggled with that as well when I first started doing this mission, because you're nabbing off poor farmers who get hijacked into this job with drugs, and I get it, you know, especially living here in California. It's a very liberal attitude towards it. You know what really is the valid reason? It's these transnational criminal organizations that are running these drugs are destabilizing and destroying Central and South America. And when we see unaccompanied minors at the border, and we see a flood of immigrants, and we see people fleeing, the gangs have controlled Honduras and have controlled Guatemala, and they're funded by these drugs. And so for me personally, the way I view it and the way our commandant views it is, it's part of a Western Hemisphere strategy. If we ignored it and we let all these drugs come in, over time, you're right, maybe the drug prices would go down, and maybe that alone would destabilize these gangs and reduce the funding for them to do the horrendous things they're doing, including human trafficking, including some would say funding terrorism. Yes, that could be true as well. But at the same time, the more immediate impact we feel is pinching them now, cutting off their supply of money, building cases, because we don't care about the guy driving the boat. He's going to go to federal court in Tampa usually, or San Diego, depending where we fly him to stand trial. And we're going to offer him a deal, and we're going to say what? Tell us who hired you, give us the deal, and we'll give you half the time. We'll give you 5 years, we'll give you 2 years instead of 10. We don't care about that guy. It's not about that guy driving that boat, and it's not about the quantity of drugs. If they want to throw all the drugs overboard and we just get our representative sample, we're fine with that too. What it is about is building the networks to try and take down the cartels. And for me personally, and for I know our commandant strategy, that is important. And I will say, if you've ever visited Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, most of Mexico nowadays, you will know that these cartels are running roughshod over the area, kicking people out of their homes, destroying people's lives, recruiting 14-year-olds to do incredible gang violence, and they're being funded by these drugs. So it's a valid argument to say, let it all in and eventually they'll collapse on their own, but I just don't think the U.S. government is willing to do that. So that's a short, controversial answer for your question. But you could have a policy class just on that, on U.S. drug law and whether U.S. drug policy is doing anything. I can tell you what gets me through it is these gangs, it's all related. They're being funded by these drugs. And so to me, to sit by and do nothing about that would be pretty difficult. And let's see what other cool slides I got here. So here's some example of just some random ways they hide these things. Here's some buoys. What happened was we saw all these fishing buoys on one boarding, and we started looking at them, and we were like, man, that's a lot of fishing buoys, and it doesn't look like they had them in the water. They pretended they were fishing. You ever see the high flyers that stick off these buoys? They go in, they mark their drift nets usually. So we started tapping on them and shaking them and realizing that they sounded funny. Sure enough, they broke one open, and that's what they found inside all these buoys. And I think it's 460 keys inside those molded foam fishing buoys. The other thing we're seeing a lot nowadays is these GPS buoys. Fishermen use these solar-powered GPS buoys to locate their drift nets and locate their crab pots and locate whatever it is. And they're a really sophisticated system. It's a company in Spain that makes them. And you can just go online and you can ping your buoy. And it has a legitimate need, right? Fishermen have to know where their stuff is. Well, it also has a use in the drug world. So they'll tie their bales to it, jettison them there, leave it. So one guy will come out, drop off a load, another guy will come down and pick up that load. And so it's a way to minimize risk. You don't get anybody carrying one load all the way. Yep. Yeah, not as frequently as you would think, because most of your commercial traffic is not looking in the water for that type of stuff. And you could run that thing down with a tanker and you'd never even need to pass it. So we've had it happen once or twice. If a fishing vessel finds it, they generally are keeping it. What's that? Yeah, you'd probably just put a, well, if you found drugs, we'd probably recommend you wait and get a sat phone and not call out anything. But yeah, good question. So that's the end of most of my cool photos and our presentation. I'm happy to answer questions. Some of the other great missions the Coast Guard does that I've had a chance to do are alien migrant interdiction. So we do a lot of migrant work, mostly in the Caribbean side. In our district here, District 11, we do get Mexican immigration coming up, but generally most Mexican migration doesn't come by sea. They generally will cross at the land borders. We do see it. They will cross from Tijuana into San Diego. We'll pick them up. It's not really a controversial process, though, because Mexican migration, we turn them over to Border Patrol on the land, and they'll take them back to Mexico through a normal process. In the Caribbean, biggest problem is Cuba. Obviously, it's one of our strategic legal issues we have, and that's our wet foot, dry foot program, where we have to interdict them at sea in order to return them, and if they get dry feet and they arrive into the United States, they get parole and the ability to stay. So that creates an incentive for people to try to evade the Coast Guard and get through. Haitian migration is also a big deal. We see large amounts of Haitian migrants coming in.
With the need diplomatic relations building with Cuba, does wet foot, dry foot still stand?
It stands as of today. I can only imagine that it will change in the near future because that incentive will become unnecessary. But there's a strong lobbying and political group of people in Florida that control much of that policy that would be very hard to change. So for now, wet foot, dry foot stands, and we still see and in fact, we've seen a huge increase in Cuban migration in the last few months since we've announced a normalization of relations with Cuba. The reason being is, I think many Cubans are worried that if things start getting cozy with the United States, that we will stop our preferential treatment of Cubans because there will no longer be a need for it, because there will be a routine visa immigration process. And so there's this huge surge right now because many people view it as their last chance to come to the United States and get that, I don't want to call it a deal, but that exception to our policy. Yep.
Is there been like considerations of other chemical value to extract from the massive amount of drugs that they're just like destroying, like a medicinal use, to be able to raise funds without having to sell drugs so that you could fund the drug war? Like, is there another way to extract value from massive amounts of cocaine?
Other than burning it and turning a wheel that creates electricity, I'm not sure.
Electricity?
It's a great question.
Electricity?
I'll have to refer you to the DEA. You should Google their lab. They might do that, actually.
That would be kind of cool if they
But I'm not aware.
Literally created power from cocaine.
I bet they could. It's a good question.
That'd be kind of fun.
Yeah.
Why does the DEA send a plane down after you capture the drug traffickers?
So we got to get them to U.S. court, right? If they're going to stand prosecution in the United States, our ships deploy for anywhere from 3 months to 6 months. So they're not coming back to the United States for a while. And courts are not too kind to keeping defendants in cuffs and on the deck of a ship for 6 months. We get away with a lot. We're able to keep people at sea for up to 30 days, sometimes 60 days. But generally the courts require a expeditious presentation before a magistrate. Now the normal 48-hour rules that apply in the civilian and the real world, I should say, don't apply to interdictions at sea, primarily because we're not arresting these people, we're detaining them. It's a legal fiction, but nonetheless, we don't give them Miranda rights, we're not questioning them at sea. So we generally are detaining them until they can get to the United States for trial. So what happens is they'll be interdicted. We'll try to coordinate one of these IMIS countries I talked about. It's willing to let us transit them through. Coordinate that with a plane that can come down and a U.S. Attorney's office that's ready to take them. And all that takes time. So it takes about 30 to 60 days sometimes.
I have a quick question.
question. You had mentioned you recognize that the people that we catch on Go Festival and whatnot, those are low-level guys.
Usually, there are exceptions. But yeah.
Okay. I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, I mean, obviously they're going to get replaced. A lot of those people are being forced into it or have their choice.
Well, that's what they'll tell you. I don't know if I agree or
Okay.
not, but that's what they'll tell you. Yeah.
Okay, but just being such low-level guys and whatnot, and they're easily replaceable. Is that
Yep, I think
agreeable?
that's absolutely true.
Is it really worth like the cost to fly them to Miami, to fly them to San Diego, put them in trial and put them in our system?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is that really worth?
But what's the alternative in a constitutional system, right? I mean, would they flog them at sea, get the information you want, and then let them go? I mean, that is right. We have to respect the rule of law, right? So we interdict people who are violating U.S. law. We want to turn them for information. We want to turn them state's evidence, if you will. We want to get them to testify against other people higher up. And so the only way to do that legally and lawfully in a rule of law, constitutional society is to put them into the system, get them before an independent magistrate who can determine if we have probable cause to hold them, and then file charges against them. I mean, sure, we would love to have a system where we could do it on the boat, turn them around, and let them go.
That's not what I mean.
But you're right.
I'm just saying, like,
it's frustrating.
That many, like, I mean, if the quantity that you're mentioning is that many, and you're deporting that many people, and you know, really, like, how many of them are really that important or could be utilized?
So the problem is, if you want to build a case against what's called a Tier 2 drug trafficking organization person, you have to have 100 Tier 1s, or Tier 3s we call them, right? So there is value because different families are controlling different loads going out. And so we need to flip 100 of these guys in order to build an articulable case against somebody that we want to extradite from Colombia, or somebody we want to extradite from Guatemala. So unfortunately, the numbers are important. Not to mention they have different tactics and procedures they can give us too. So for instance, it's not just about ratting out the guy above you. It's about telling us, hey, why did you take the route you took? Why did you hide the drugs the way you held it? That's all intel value to us. And the only way you can get that in our system, right, or at least lawfully and within the rule of law, is to put them in the system and get that, extract that information through negotiation, through bargaining. You know, again, that is the only way to get that type of tactics, techniques, intelligence, in addition to what the U.S. Attorney wants, which is testimony against higher level drug traffickers. That makes sense?
Well, the only reason why I bring it up is it's not necessarily like maybe I do or do not agree, but it's a current topic. It's just you know, overcrowded prison systems and whatnot. And you know, that's one of the arguments that people are making is, you know, if that's, you know, it's really ethical to do that.
I will tell you that the overcrowding arguments, these are federal prisoners. Most of the discussions you're hearing about the penal system involves your state criminal prosecutions. The states, and I don't just mean California. California has a crisis, but almost every state has a crisis of overcrowded prisons. These guys are going to federal prison. They're serving their time in there. They're getting their knees worked on. They're getting their hernias fixed, and then they're sent back to their country in 2 to 5 years. So the overcrowding argument doesn't sell as well in the federal system. Granted, the federal system is just it's a more efficient system. It has space. It actually works. Anybody else? Yep.
I was going to say, kind of on that, I was just kind of wondering your personal opinion on, like, improving. Like, if you were, like, since you're the lawyer, you know the law, and you know, like, how would you do it in a better legal system where you think, wow, America's doing just, you know.
Well, that's a loaded question, man. Are you talking about in general or in the drug war terms?
In the drug war, per se, since this is kind of the topic of tonight, but it's just kind of catching drug wars and responding in general.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in general, and I could go on for hours and hours, but in general, we do need more focus on treatment, for sure, and on rehabilitation. And I think our whole legal system struggles with that because we are overwhelmed. I think quick plea bargains and plea deals are an integral part of keeping our system moving. But in reality, I think the number one thing is funding for our judiciary, and that's going all the way down to our state level as well. We just have overburdened courts. We have not enough services that we can provide for defendants to rehabilitate them. And I think if anything needed to be fixed, it isn't the fundamentals of our system, it's not our laws, it's our organization and structure. I mean, if you look at the statistics, the federal court system runs on 1%, less than 1% of our federal budget. I mean, that's insane. An entire branch of government, Article 3 of the Constitution, runs on 1% of our federal budget. And if you look at the states, it's pretty similar. And so that's a real problem, because then we can't provide the type of other rehabilitation, the addiction services, counseling, the things that we probably need to be doing. So I'll give you that. Well, thank you guys so much for your time. I really do appreciate it. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Thanks again.
All right, great.